Welcome. Without change, we accept the status quo. Dare I say that the premise for tonight and all we are doing in community conversations is that we have an obligation to make a difference. On behalf of all involved, I thank you so much for joining us tonight. For those that don't know me, my name is Bruce Stanger, and I am the program chair for Community Conversations on Racial Inequity. Community Conversations on Racial Inequity. There's a lot there. It's a year-long series designated to shine a light on racism in America and the Jewish community's role in creating a more racially just society. Community Conversations is jointly presented by the Jewish Community Relations Council and the Jewish Leadership Academy, both part of the Jewish Federation of Greater Hartford. And we are extremely grateful to Liberty Bank for its financial support, which makes this series possible. I must add that the Jewish Federation was incredibly welcoming and encouraging when they heard the seed of this idea, providing all sorts of resources and support, truly making a difference. As much as I would like to name those who made such a difference in the program, I note that you should see that there are many names on the materials you have received and will receive in the future. Those and others each make a remarkable difference in all we do. I thank them on behalf of the community. Before I introduce our moderator and panelists, I want to make sure you are aware of the reading program that accompanies the community conversations. This is a little commercial. We hope you'll join us. We are leading a community-wide reading and discussion of Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. It's about the American Black community's great migration from the South in the 20th century and from the rural South to the cities of the North and West, including Hartford. It will culminate in a community discussion in August. A reading and discussion guide is available, and we can also help you find a book group if you don't have one that might want to read this already, or if you don't have another community that might want to read this together. If you'd like to learn more, please reach out to me, Alana Butler, or Jody Engel after the program. Now, I'm honored to introduce tonight's moderator and panelists. Our moderator, Elysa Graber-Lipperman, is a member of the Community Conversations Program Committee, and she is also the incoming chair of the Jewish Leadership Academy's Advisory Board, a big job. Elysa is a graduate of the Wexner Heritage Program, as am I, and a longtime community volunteer in addition to her successful law practice. Our panelists, Dr. Susannah Heschel and Deacon Art Miller, Deacon Miller, have both distinguished themselves in the fields of Black-Jewish relations and racial justice, and both have spent a lifetime surrounded by and involved in the civil rights struggle. Dr. Heschel is the Eli M. Black Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College, where she teaches courses on modern Judaism, modern Jewish thought, and modern Jewish history. She is the author of numerous books and articles and the recipient of 4 honorary doctorates, soon to be 5, we are told. Dr. Heschel is also continuing the amazing work of her father, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, an influential Jewish theologian and close friend of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Imagine being in the room when they spoke. Dr. King Rabbi Abraham Heschel believed that Judaism's prophetic tradition demands our participation in the struggle for racial justice. Deacon Miller is a noted Catholic leader and civil rights veteran. We are so pleased to have him with us, who is still, in the words of Christian tradition, fighting the good fight. Deacon Miller is Director Emeritus of the Archdiocese of Hartford's Office for Black Catholic Ministries. He grew up on Chicago's South Side and was arrested and jailed. It's good to be proud of that. for peacefully protesting systemic racism in the summer of '63. He is a certified trainer in Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolence philosophy and a good friend to the Jewish community who has worked closely with the Anti-Defamation League. Please join us in welcoming Elysa, Dr. Heschel, and Deacon Miller.
Thank you, Bruce. It is truly an honor to be part of tonight's discussion with Dr. Heschel and Deacon Miller, and I welcome you all to our community conversation. Beginning with Deacon Miller, I'm going to ask you both to start us off by speaking for about 3 minutes each about the successes and challenges of Black and Jewish relations in the past and present from your own point of view.
Well, I only have 3 minutes. You're asking a preacher to talk for just 3 minutes. I don't know if I'm able to do that, but it certainly is a joy to be here. I'm from Chicago, and Chicago is known as a place where the Black and Jewish vote was linked together. That it was a place of symbiotic relationships. I remember vividly going to some of the Jewish shopkeepers when I was growing up in our community. And it was just an extraordinarily warm relationship. When I went to jail at the age of 17 as a soon-to-be freshman at the University of Illinois at the behest of Dr. King, who called us there, Bernie Sanders was one of those who was arrested at the same time I was, as well as other members of the Jewish community. And quite frankly, I thought nothing of it. The community was one, and I probably would have been surprised had there not been any people there who were Jewish. And I had to remember that, frankly, because when I saw Bernie Sanders and I realized he was arrested at the same time, is when I realized there were Jewish people there. Because other than that, it was not a part of our conversations. But it did strike me when I eventually moved here to Connecticut that there was not a relationship between the Black and the Jewish communities. And the loss of the profound cultural similarities was lost on the folks that were here. So I began the process of reaching out to those in the Jewish community, people like Bob Fishman and Laura Brocksterman and others who I knew we could have a relationship. And how do we build a relationship and thus begin to build a community? With the profound familiarities that we have, how can we not be but one? And that be a symbiotic relationship, not a parasitic relationship. Because in a parasitic relationship, someone is going to die. But together, the needs that we all have that are similar are far greater than those things that separate us. If we only take a moment and look at it, if we only take a moment and believe it, if we only take a moment and trust in that, it is a remarkable and strong bond that must be fed. I must add also to that there was Friedman, Jim Friedman, who was also a part of my very close relationship when I moved here. That's 3 minutes.
Thank you. Dr. Heschel.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be with you. And as you know, I went to Trinity College, so I spent a lot of time in West Hartford. And I have a warm feeling about the community there and Rabbi Kessler and Bethel Synagogue. And so it's great that you're doing this program, and it's wonderful for me to be with Deacon Miller. I, of course, would love to talk about my father's relationship with Martin Luther King, which was an intense relationship over many years. But I also want to say something in a broader sense of why it was so important to so many rabbis, many of whom were refugees from Hitler, and also to so many young Jews to go to the South to demonstrate and in many cases put their own lives at risk and even suffer the consequences, as we know. So the question is why? And I think what did the civil rights movement do for young Jews in that era, in the late 50s, early 60s? It was just a few years after the Holocaust. Jews in the 50s were uncomfortable displaying their Jewishness in America. Sociologists have observed that Jewish kids would hide their Sunday school books in brown paper wrapping if they took them to public school with them. But there was something about the civil rights movement. Dr. King, first of all, made the Hebrew Bible, the prophets and Moses and the Exodus central to the civil rights movement. And that gave us a sense of pride, as if our Bible now had such great meaning in the national scene. I think the civil rights movement also was inspiring. Look what we can stand for together. We stand for justice. We stand for the principles of the Bible. After all, Dr. King quoted from the prophets, especially from the prophet Amos.
Yes.
All the time. Yes. and I think, frankly, that also restored our souls after the Holocaust. It helped us recover. For my father, that relationship was very important. He met Dr. King in January of 1963 in Chicago, as it happens, at a conference on religion and race. They both gave keynote lectures and they met and they bonded. And within a few months, they were going around the country lecturing together. They talked about racism. They talked about the importance of getting the Jews out of the Soviet Union. They talked about Israel. They talked about the war in Vietnam, which was a major problem as you know, in the early 60s, because it turned out that we really were just turning that war into dropping napalm on civilians, war crimes. There were no military political objectives. And so I also was present at Riverside Church when Dr. King spoke out against the war in April of 1967, just a year before he was assassinated. But the last thing I want to mention is that my father had invited Dr. and Mrs. King to our home for the Passover Seder in 1968. And Dr. King was assassinated shortly before Passover. But I think that it's worth thinking about this and imagining, what would you do with your Passover Seder if Dr. King attended? What would you talk about, given the centrality of the Exodus for the civil rights movement? What would you present in commentaries on the Haggadah, for example? So I would just say that, finally, my father, as you know, marched in Selma. The biggest issue right now for me is people often display the photograph of my father with Dr. King marching in Selma with a Hawaiian lei. That photograph needs to be a challenge, not simply a source of pride or nostalgia, because they've marched for voting rights. And those voting rights have been eviscerated by the Supreme Court in 2013 and now by state legislatures around the country. And if that photograph means something, if their relationship means something to us, we have to turn that around. America was made into a democracy by the civil rights movement. It was not a democracy if not every citizen can vote. That's not a democracy. So the civil rights movement made America a democracy. And now that democracy is becoming fragile from inside. So we need to stand with the civil rights movement, with that relationship. And there's much more to say, but I'll stop here by 3 minutes.
Thank you. I love what you're both saying about relationships and working together. So would you each spend some time commenting on any misconceptions you have heard or come across regarding Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement, and how you think these misconceptions impact Black and Jewish relations going forward?
Well, I'll start first. From my perspective, there was always a concern within the Black community that the civil rights movement had to be led by Black folks. Now, it is not a misconception in the Black community, But I have heard in the white community that the civil rights movement had to be led by white folks because Black people couldn't do it. But in the Black community, we know what we were and how we did what we did. It has not been a deterrence at all within the Black community, particularly during those very vulgar years of the early 60s, when your very life was on the line. What I remember vividly is that when you got hit or struck, it didn't matter if you were Jewish or Black or Asian, it hurt the same. But it also was so important that we stood up the same for the same cause of humanity. One last thing, and it's bringing everything up to date about the June 19th celebration that just occurred on Saturday. That celebration of June 19th, 1865, if we really consider it, is not a Black holiday. It is a holiday for America that for the first time it had on paper and finally was validated when those troops walked into Galveston, Texas, that this country, at least on paper and by word, was free. And that everybody should celebrate that white folks were free from the horrid burden of slavery and enslaving God's children. And those who were enslaved celebrate that they no longer, at least on paper, were enslaved. So it is a truly American and democratic holiday, democracy holiday. But I truly believe that the one other thing that I would like to talk about is the Black Lives Matter issue that I know comes up, but I'll wait till later so that I don't spend too much time because I'm really interested in listening to Dr. Heschel.
Thanks. There's so much that I think we both want to talk about. It's hard to know what not to say, everything. First of all, I think it's important for us as Jews to recognize what my father recognized, which is that the civil rights movement was a great gift to the Jewish people. It was also important for my father to point out that white Jews in this story were Pharaoh. We like to think of ourselves as being the enslaved in Egypt, the Israelites who were enslaved. But in America, it turns out we're the Pharaoh. So there's a lot of self-criticism that we have to undertake, which is a good Jewish thing to do. There is a movement in Judaism, the Mussar movement, the ethical movement, but there's a lot of internal self-exploration of what goes on in one's mind and heart. And we need to do that. I think we also have to, well, I would say we have to consider the issue of trauma. That is, after the Holocaust, as a colleague of mine, a Protestant theologian in Germany said, you don't walk out of Auschwitz with a smile on your face. Think about the lingering trauma for those who survived, for those family members who lost people who were killed, for the next generation and the next generation. It doesn't just go away, that trauma. And the same is true, of course, all the more so for people who were enslaved and for their descendants. There is a lingering trauma that I think would be helpful for us to talk about. The differences, these are different experiences, yes, but nonetheless, trauma is trauma. So maybe that is one of the areas where American Jews, white and Black and Asian, all colors, can get together with Black Americans and talk about what trauma means, the trauma of our histories in the plural. I also just want to say that the turn to Black nationalism and nationalist movements that Deacon Miller alluded to a moment ago was also another gift for Jews. My colleague Mark Dolinger has written a book about this. That is Black nationalism that emerged in the mid-late 60s, demanded, for example, Black studies as a field at universities. And Jews picked up on that and said, yes, we want Jewish studies too. Jews picked up on Black nationalism and became much more deeply involved with Israel in the late 60s, more so than before. So I think there are ways in which we as Jews need to express and recognize our gratitude to the civil rights movement. And I'll just finally say that my father used to say, my father came from Poland, from a Hasidic family. And he was used to that kind of davening, of praying. And he used to say that if there's any hope for the future of Judaism in America, it lies with the Black church, because he felt that that's where there was a kind of piety that he knew from Europe, a European Judaism that was destroyed by the Nazis. But he felt that spirit he could feel in Black churches. So there are many ways in which Jews should recognize and express gratitude.
Thank you. I hear the need from both of you for understanding and communication and appreciation, and it really resonates. What do you see, what do each of you see as common causes or issues that Jewish people and people of color should work on together first? What should they prioritize?
I'm enjoying listening to Dr. Heschel, and let me make one comment as it regards the piety of worship, the understanding of the need for contemplative thought that permeates throughout most Black communities, and taking from a small gift and seeing the hand of God within that is very emblematic in both of our communities, that God's mystical hand touches in so many different ways and never taken for granted. The reliance on God in all things is so prevalent within the Black Catholic and Christian communities. So thank you for touching on that. As it regards what we can do and work on together is to recognize the beauty of our cultures, that what we can learn from one another, the idea of sticking up for one another, to broaden the tent of our understanding. Our commonalities are so important. The truth that I have felt the pain of hatred. I have felt the pain of ugliness. And if there's no other thing that calls us to be brothers and sisters, it is at least that, to recognize that we can stand up for one another, because I need your voice. My people need your voice. And now you need ours. And because we have this common understanding of pain, and in fact, I once said that in the Black community, in the African community, we have our own Holocaust, when 12 million Africans died in the Middle Passage, the ugliness of all of that, and the residual effects of hundreds of years of rape and torture and mutilization and slavery permeates our id, continues to be a part of how we've learned to exist. And I would like to just give you one example. I have an older sister who is 7 years older than I. When she was about 8 years old, she was sexually assaulted and abused. And my mom and dad didn't know how or what to do. It was so long ago. Well, that torture for my sister continued. And she married someone who was brutal. And we believe it's because her understanding of her body and herself was to be an instrument of someone else's brutality. And She had a daughter and a son. Now their growing up was terrible based on the terrible abuse my sister had when she was 7 years old. They were impacted by their mother's abuse that happened years and decades before they were born. Now my niece and my nephew have children, and their children are negatively affected by their grandmother's abuse that happened when their grandmother was 7. Now they are having children. And so 4 generations are affected by this ugly, horrible sexual abuse that happened years before their mothers were born. That's what has happened in the Black communities. That kind of abuse affects the psyche of everyone that is the child of that. And it has affected our community, as it has affected, as Dr. Heschel said, when folks came out of Dachau, they had to have some way of shedding the terror of that time. You can't just be okay. There has to be a moment of dealing with those issues. And I believe that the Jewish and the Black community can help one another heal by just listening to one another, by walking with one another.
Dr. Heschel.
Thank you, Deacon Miller. That's a very powerful and terrible story, but I'm glad you told us. And I think perhaps it's a good moment to keep in mind that the idea that someone can do such a horrible thing to a child is a curse on humanity that we have to overcome. The idea that you have the right to the body of another person, to abuse another human being, to torture a person, that is something that, of course, affected and infected whoever it was who abused your sister. And it's also in many ways a legacy of slavery and the mentality of slavery, which is that you have the right to the body of another human being. And of course, we know we don't. No one has the right to the body of another human being. So we have to work together. And I believe very strongly with you that we need allies and we need good listeners. It's important for us to be witnesses to other people's suffering, to acknowledge it, to think about it, even as we, at the same time, have to work to change basic institutions of society. I wonder about the legacy of slavery in this country, for one thing, and the connections between emancipation of the slaves on the one hand and the establishment of police forces and the ownership of weapons and guns, the connection between slavery on the one hand and mass incarceration on the other, as Michelle Alexander has written about. There are more Black men in prison today than were enslaved in pre-Civil War United States. There are connections there. There is, in addition, racism. One of the things that I think Jews have learned or must learn from Zionism and from the state of Israel is that the external appearances should in no way be what defines a human being. If you go to Israel, and I tell you, I was glued to Israeli television on my computer 2 weeks ago when they showed the Knesset meeting, the parliament meeting for the new government being installed. And I saw the people in this new government in the cabinet, so many women and people of Jews who are Black-skinned and Jews who are disabled. And the collection was extraordinary. the point of Zionism is it doesn't matter if you are a Jew from China or India or North Africa or Europe, it doesn't matter. These things don't matter. It should be Zionism, a lesson to us that racism has no place in our human lives. I think that's one of the great lessons of Zionism to Jews. And I know that not all Jews have learned that lesson, but they need to, because we have Jews who are Black and Jews who are Asian and Jews of all different kinds. And I think it's great. And I think Israel is a lesson to everybody. Racism has to go. That's it.
Thank you. Yeah, we all have to learn more and educate ourselves and be sensitive to the tragedies and suffering that we've all experienced. And thank you for sharing. In your respective opinions, if we were to work in solidarity, is it necessary for us to agree on everything? And can you describe how you deal with potential partners who disagree with you on important issues?
Well, if I might, I've been married 50 years. 35 were happy. So let me just say, if I ever agreed with everybody on everything, then it wouldn't be a very interesting conversation. It is through disagreement that we grow. What we have to do is make certain we have custody of our egos so that we're willing to hear what the other person is saying. You know, we are called to bear witness to one another's pain. The worst thing you can do with someone is to dismiss their pain. And it is not easy always to bear witness, but we're called to do that in a very short story. I mentioned my wife. Well, we have 4 children, and when she was pregnant with our first children, I was a very attentive father. I went to every Lamont class they had. If she had morning sickness, I'd have a washcloth. I'd just do everything. And when the babies came, I was there at the hospital and trying to help as best I could and keep out of the way. But when the babies were born, if I ever told my wife I understood what it meant to be pregnant, she'd smack me in the mouth because I couldn't understand. But what I could do is I could bear witness to this woman. I knew that if I drove and I took a turn too quickly, even though I didn't have and I wasn't nauseous, she would be, because I was a witness to her pain. That's what we have to be, is a witness to one another's pain, to their joy, to their goodness, to all of the things that we can get to know one another. And then the whole idea that comes in Psalm 139 about our being wonderfully made and being knitted in our mother's womb and knowing us, and that I'm wonderfully made and knowing us way before we were born. This makes us brothers and sisters under the one and most holy God. I'm sorry I started preaching again. I just can't help it.
It's communication.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I find it very unfortunate when people put up barriers and say, you can't come into my coalition unless you agree with me on this or that point. And why would I even want to talk to people who agree with me? Then it's actually rather boring. So yes, we do need to make a real alliance, means an alliance with people whom we don't agree with. Those are the people we want to talk to. We want to talk to them because we want to hear their point of view. And I have to say, as a teacher, I tell all my students, you can say anything, ask me any question. You can make a comment about Israeli politics, right wing, left wing. I've heard everything. You tell me anything you want and we'll discuss it. And I will make every effort I can to talk in an open and thoughtful way with any student. That's really how we should be in this world. There's too much contention and too much anger. That worries me so much. Why is there so much rage and resentment? I don't understand it. We live, I think, in an extraordinary country with amazing resources. Whoever thought, I mean, I have air conditioning in this hot day. What a miracle. When did kings and queens in history have air conditioning on a hot day? So I can hardly believe this great, extraordinary good fortune.
Yes.
So yes, I think we need to rejoice and put aside the rage.
Amen.
Yes.
You can
we
preach
all,
at my church anytime you want.
and we all need empathy and to get out from behind our screens and our character limits. And yeah,
And to
amen.
celebrate the differences that we are. To know that there's someone who has different experiences that will make me better, to grow further. When I grow, it does not mean someone else is losing. You know, it's like a
Appreciating
marriage.
that.
Marriage is one of those things where you can give 100% of yourself, but never lose any of yourself.
That's beautiful. So many people who have joined us this evening have been reading The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabella Wilkerson, and it's a book about the Great Migration.
Which I was a part of. My mom was from Louisiana and came up in 1919.
Oh, wow. So yeah, this question would be very germane, to your own experience. And, let's talk a little bit about your views on the migration playing a role in Black and Jewish relations. I'd love to hear both of your takes on that.
Well, I can speak to my experience coming up to Chicago. And there was the Jewish community that hired and helped and welcomed us. And I don't like to say what I hear when folks say, oh yeah, some of my best friends are Black people. It really just girds me. But I went to my first cousin's bar mitzvah. So it's very difficult when everyone in your family is, well, not everyone, so many are Jewish or Black or Christian, and in fact, even Muslim, that it broadens your understanding. But what we knew when coming up, or at least my mom told me, that when coming up, that they understood where they could go and buy food and be treated decently was into the Jewish community. And so if you wanted to find a job, you could go into the Jewish community. So that kind of is my understanding of the reception that Black folks receive when coming up north.
Dr. Heschel.
So this brings me back to something that James Baldwin once wrote in that article and commentary. He said, in Harlem, Black people are not anti-Semitic, they're anti-white. If you live in Harlem, and this was back, 50, 70 years ago, you resented it. Of course, the housing was not good. There was vermin in the housing. The schools were lousy. There were no parks for kids to play in. There was no hope for upward mobility. It was similar to Jews living in the Pale of Settlement in Russia. No hope for upward mobility, no possibility of higher education, no way to have a better life for your kids. Pale of Settlement was one of the most impoverished parts of the world, according to a US congressional delegation that visited. And Harlem too. So sometimes it's important for us as Jews to remember that I'm Jewish and I'm also white, and I have responsibilities in both. I'm also a woman, and I have to face both anti-Semitism and sexism. So things are complicated, and that's why we have this concept of intersectionality. That is, my experience is both as a Jew and as a woman. I love to go to my Orthodox synagogue. I'm not so crazy about sitting behind the curtain. It's a mixture. My experience is not the same as my husband's. So that's how it is. We're working on making changes, of course. I guess one last thing I might want to mention is that scholars work a lot, scholars of anti-Semitism work a lot on the question of what happened in the modern period that anti-Semitism became so severe. The second half of the 19th century in Germany became racial anti-Semitism, very severe. And to some extent, and of course, scholars of racism and slavery ask something similar. What is it in the modern period that suddenly created this notion of races that we didn't have before?
Mm.
To some extent, the Europeans who were involved in the slave trade in Western Europe and in the United States, they developed all these horrible ideas about Black people, gave themselves permission to torture and kill and enslave Black people.
Yes.
In Germany, they didn't have a slave trade going, but they did have Jews living there, and they turned against the Jews. And of course, ultimately led to death camps, gas chambers. But these, in some sense, these are not in any way equivalent, and they're not the same, but they are two different things that happened in the same era. What is it about the modern period? We have science, we have rationality, we have medicine being great, technology, and yet there is something missing. There's a kind of heart and soul that's missing that has allowed us to really do some horrible things and think in horrible categories.
Yeah.
So modernity was good in some respects, but it was deeply flawed in others. And I think as Jews and as Black people, and Jews, I say Black Jews, Asian Jews, white Jews, Black people, whether they're Jewish or Christian or any other religious tradition, Muslim, we have to think together about this. What to do about this amazing modernity that has such a deep flaw right at its heart.
Yeah.
Yes, when
It
humanity
is
can be just so ugly and
you know, it is
and
a
shocking.
remarkable thing that human beings have this capacity to otherize folks, that by the only way that I can do horrible things to someone else, if I dehumanize who they are, then I am not bad, then I am not evil. I want to share one thing with you that I've begun using, and I would hope that those who are here listening to this will spread it. I want you to know I have never been biased against because I'm Black. I have never been discriminated against because I'm Black. My friend Emmett Till was not murdered because he was Black. Now, that doesn't say that I have not been biased against, nor discriminated against, nor done or terrible things and the like have not happened. They most assuredly have. But when they do, it is not because I'm Black. It's because the other person's broken. I'm fine. I'm a beautiful Black man. And I have come to recognize and embrace that when I look at others who have these horrible thoughts and beliefs within them, I'm not the one that needs to be changed. I am not the one that is broken. No one discriminates against you because you're Jewish. No one discriminates against you because you're a woman. No one discriminates against you because you're gay. They do it because they are broken human beings. And once we begin to embrace the truth of what's in Psalm 139 and truly love ourselves, then we can look at one another and begin to see the light of God within them. So please understand, Emmett Till was not murdered because he was Black. He was murdered because of the construct of that society was based on hatred. Emmett Till was the victim. The community was the perpetrator. The state of Mississippi was the perpetrator, and the United States of America, for tolerating Mississippi and Money, Mississippi, and that construct of racial hatred, was in fact the perpetrator of that crime. So from now on, no one does anything because you're Jewish horrible to you. It's because of who they are. Get control of who we are. Every bully is broken inside before they bully someone else.
Yeah, it's so important to see God's face in everyone. Thank you for that. Dr. Heschel, do you want to add anything to Deacon Miller's comments?
I just, first of all, very much appreciate everything, Deacon Miller, that you've said this evening. Thank you. And perhaps I'll just mention something that happened to me once, many, many years ago when I was a graduate student and I was in the former East Germany, so communist East Germany, behind the Iron Curtain. I went to a small conference in East Berlin, and it was a Jewish Christian discussion with people who really had never heard much, or they knew, but they hadn't talked about the Holocaust, and they had never heard from a Jew. And they were very resistant and not very sympathetic. But I was there with a few people. We pushed back, and it was somewhat tense. And at the end of the gathering, at the end of this conference, 2 days, I thought it would be appropriate to have a little closing prayer. And the person I was working with, a minister, Rainer Graupner, said, let's say the Lord's Prayer. And I said, no, that's a Christian prayer. No. So instead, we said, we'll say a psalm. He read the psalm in German, I read it in Hebrew. And after we read the psalm, it just felt as though the room wasn't yet really, needed something more. And I turned to him and said, why don't you say the Lord's Prayer? And he then turned to the group and the couple of hundred people, and he told them I had first objected, but now I said it was all right to say the Lord's Prayer. And they all stood up and they started reciting it. And when they came to the line about forgive us our sins, they suddenly knew what sins we were talking about. We were talking about the Nazis and about the Holocaust, and people started weeping. We all were crying by the end. And that was transformative for everybody, certainly for me too, but for people who were there. And sometimes what's important is not so much the arguments we present in a formal lecture and a discussion. Sometimes we just reach the hearts of people. And it's through the heart that people begin to be transformed.
Mm.
Yes, that shared experience. So thank you. We've received some questions while you've been speaking, and I'm going to turn now to inviting you to respond to them from our engaged participants sending questions. Our first question, why historically has there been friction between Black people and Jews since we both are groups of persecution? How can we be mutually inclusive and focus on positive engagement?
Well, as Dr. Heschel had indicated earlier, I believe if there's any misgivings between Jews and Blacks, it's not the Jewish part, it's the white part and the Black part. I think the Jewish part, in terms of any kind of animus, in my life's experience, has not been there at all. In my life experience, I've not run into, as was quoted about, that most of the Black folks I know aren't anti-Semites. I don't know a whole bunch of anti-white people.
Well, I think when Jews first came, for example, to South Carolina and dedicated a temple there in Charleston, they talked about leaving behind Europe with its anti-Semitism and its racism and coming to the freedom of America. And yet South Carolina, Charleston was a slave-free city. So I think Jews came also with a desire to be recognized as white. There was also, that my father was in New York City and went south, as did many, but there were rabbis who, on the one hand, in the South, suffered because 10% of the bombings in the South during the Civil Rights era, 10% were synagogues. And some rabbis were cautious about getting involved. Some didn't like it. Some wanted to identify as white. We have a mixed record. But I think the issue for Jews is, to what extent do we want to win acceptance as white people in this country? And to what extent do we want to stand up for principles that we hope will also be protective of us as Jews?
Thank you. The next question, can you suggest ways to consider enlightening communities that are resistant to considering and are accepting the Black Jewish connection, as I have in Farmington?
You go first this time, Dr. Heschel.
Well, first of all, you know, there's always a problem saying the Black Jewish relation or Black Jewish connection, because there are also Jews who are Black. There are Black people who are Jewish and rabbis even. So, you know, we have to think differently and come up with different kinds of language and so on. What to do? I say talk to people, try to transform people, try to change their minds. There are all kinds of ways to do that. I think conversation, I think there are interfaith services, there are films, there are all kinds of media, books to read and so on. But yes, it's hard. I think having friends, relationships we talked about earlier, very important.
Yeah, it's exactly, it's education, learning about Jewish people, learning about, I mean, through clearly in the Black community, particularly the Christian community, the embracing of the Talmud, the embracing of Jewish scripture is a part of the upbringing, but also becoming allies with one another. And what an ally means is standing up for a Jewish person if there's no Jewish person around, or standing up for gay folks when there are no gay folks around. This summer, with the coronavirus leaving, we'll have our picnics and barbecues and the like. And if someone, you know, our Uncle Charlie comes over and he has, you know, too much of that special punch and starts to, you know, say, well, you know about those Black people, or you know how those gay people are, you know how those Jews are, all of that stuff. That's the moment you stand up and say, no, not in my house, and begin to teach and live what we say we believe in. When we are unwilling to stand up to the truth because we are afraid, then ugliness will continue to grow. We must live every day the way we say we want to.
Thank you. Our next question is, Jews experience both privilege and trauma. How do these two positions work together? And what does this look like in day-to-day advocacy? As white people, how can we make more room for the experiences of people of color?
Well, I think that was for you, Dr. Heschel.
Since it's such a broad question, I have to perhaps define it a little bit to make it more manageable. But I think that this is really something that we've been talking about all evening. In fact, I think there are also ways in which we need to push ourselves, let's say. That is, we have a tendency, I have found among Jews, to talk about what we did in the civil rights movement as if the story is really about us, and it isn't. So maybe we need to think about ourselves differently and think about our history differently, and be willing to accept, for example, flaws in Jewish history, and also some really bad things, not only flaws, and start to confront ourselves so that we can make a little room in our lives, in our minds, in our narratives that will allow us to understand what our responsibilities are, historically speaking. So just as an example, the historian Natalie Z. Davis at the University of Toronto came across a Passover Haggadah at the university rare book room that was from Suriname, and it was owned by a Jewish family that had a slave plantation. And she wrote an article about it, and she asked, what does it mean on Passover to sit down at your table and read the Haggadah and talk about being liberated from slavery when you yourself own thousands of slaves? What is that? What does that mean? Why is it that there's a Hebrew prayer for purchasing a slave? And by the way, no prayer for giving birth to a baby. So the question that you ask is on a personal level, but I'm also responding to it on a much broader level of how we write Jewish history and how we think of ourselves in relation to that history. Our history is not only a history of suffering, a lachrymose history of being subjected to anti-Semitism. There are also moments in our history when, in fact, we did wrong things and we need to face up to that.
And I think, if I could add, all communities have, and it is our willingness. In fact, if we were to think of the critical race theory or the Project 1619, all of these kinds of moments of opportunity to learn, when they are looked at as scants and predetermined that they offer no good, then how are we going to ever learn? I've often been concerned about the Nation of Islam and how it has been such a horrid example of anti-Semitism, or the organization called Black Lives Matter. How often I've had to explain that the words Black Lives Matter does not belong to anyone. In fact, if I were to show this, this is a picture of when I marched through the north end of Hartford, Connecticut, which is wrought with violence and drugs. And we were marching. That picture, that's me there, that very good looking man with the black shirt on. You may not recognize me now, but we were marching 20 years ago for Black Lives Matter, trying to let us know that we were vital, even though the community said we were less than. And so it is to understand that there will be pockets of folks who may not like who you are, but that does not mean that we can be infected by thoughts that are not ours, that the greater good is always done by the most people. And most people need to be led by voices like yours.
So let's see, we have time for one more question.
My goodness.
Eric Ward, who wrote Skin in the Game and who is Black, says that anti-Semitism is at the root of all white nationalism. Can you discuss your thoughts on how our two communities can work together to combat the documented rise of white nationalism?
That's a volume of work that has begun its writings in 1865 and has continued to be written today. That's such a breadth of work. It is the only way that we can do it is one person at a time. We may feel that our little efforts are too small, but our collective efforts in confronting evil wherever we find it, wherever we see it, that 11th commandment about thou shalt not be a bystander, we must confront in every moment, in every place, whenever ugliness rises its head. And that means every place, every time, with no excuse, even if it is your own aunt, your own uncle, your own mother or father, your child. When there is this demeaning of another human being, it must be confronted. To do otherwise is to allow ugly and horrid and vulgar nationalism to continue.
Dr. Heschel.
So there's so much to be said about this question of the rise of what is called white nationalism, which is a problematic term for many reasons, but it's really a movement of hate that directs itself against us as Jews, Black, Asians, Muslims, and so on, gay people. We all need to form an alliance. But the question is, what's at the root of it, and what is it that we can actually address and try to change. And there are many roots. So first of all, it's Christian. There's certain elements that Christian churches need to take up their responsibility. There's also the political element of being an anti-democratic movement, an anti-American movement, a movement that sought, of course, to invade the Capitol, which is treasonous. It's an insurrection. But there's something else too, which is that these kinds of movements, just like the Nazi movement, tries to formulate an emotional experience. It tries to generate emotions. Hitler tried to appeal to the emotions and transform them in certain ways. And you could see this in Charlottesville with the people with the tiki torches and screaming. This was a parade. This was something that was an experience. So what can we do to distract people from wanting that kind of an experience, and also do something about the underlying emotions that strong men appeal to universally? There's an Israeli scholar named Ruth Ben-Ghiat who published a book recently called Strong Men that I thought was very helpful, about how these authoritarian leaders appeal to feelings of being a victim, of anger, of resentment, rage, jealousy, envy, and so forth. They appeal to those emotions. So we need, I think, especially religious leaders, to do something to calm the emotions of this country right now, calm the rage and the
resentment. Then turn on that one over there.
What can be done about that to change the atmosphere so that those emotions will die down, and stronger emotions of warmth, friendliness, collegiality, community, and not hate will predominate? It's a big job.
I like combining your two responses about the individual responsibility and the collective responsibility. And so thank you. Unfortunately, we reached the time to end our program. On behalf of the Jewish Federation of Greater Hartford's Jewish Leadership Academy and our Jewish Community Relations Council, I want to thank our esteemed panelists, Professor Susannah Heschel and Deacon Art Miller. We are so very grateful for your participation in tonight's program, the wisdom you imparted, your insight, and your thoughtful comments. You gave us a lot to think about, and we've learned so much. I also want to thank everyone who joined us for tonight's conversation and your submitted questions. We hope our community conversations on racial inequity programming, along with our community book read, provide a safe space for your own journeys to learn about and reflect on systemic racism. And we hope the conversations and learning continue. Perkei Avot provides us all with a clear directive. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. Special thanks to Joe Schubert and Susan Stoppelman, who were instrumental in putting tonight's program together. Thank you to Bruce Stanger, Alana Butler, Jody Angel, Heather Fiedler, Laura Zimmerman, David Warren, and all the members of the Federation staff for everything you do. We are grateful to Liberty Bank's corporate sponsorship of our community conversations programs. JLA is supported from the Jewish Federation of Greater Hartford and funded by the Jewish Community Foundation. JLA is developed with support from the Jewish Federation of Greater Hartford and funded by the Jewish Community Foundation, the Auerbach Shiro Foundation, the Samuel Roskin Trust at Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, Lee and Richard Rubenstein, Lisa and Peter Fishman, Alan and Michelle Parker, Howard and Patty Weiner, Leslie Silvers, and Sandy and Arnie Dashevsky. Have a good evening. Please plan to join us for our next program to be held on Thursday, July 15th at 7 p.m., during which we will be examining the impact of education and housing on racial segregation in Connecticut. Thank you again for joining us.